Alright guys, so we're going to do section 2 right now, Christianity and Medieval Civilization. So, as we've talked about before, Christianity, kind of like the only thing that people have to look up to, they're uneducated, so life's kind of crappy, so all we have to look forward to is getting to heaven someday, right? So, why were church leaders often at odds with European rulers, and what role did Christianity play during the Middle Ages? We'll talk about that. The Catholic Church played a dominant role in the lives of people during the High Middle Ages. Their strong leadership by popes made the Catholic Church a forceful presence in medieval society. So there's not secularization yet. There's not a separation of church and state. They're all kind of ruled by one. A king will, it's all diplomatic. It's not really religious at all. It's all about politics and money. A king will pay homage, say, hey, I support the Pope, and then the Pope will give him a kickback of funds, and it's all politics. There's not really much about religion going on. So some key terms you need to know is lay investiture, interdict, a sacrament, heresy, inquisition, a relic, what all that stuff is. People to identify: Pope Gregory VII, Henry IV, Innocent III, Hildegard of Bingen, and Saint Francis of Assisi. Places to locate, which you already have: the Papal States and Assisi.
In 1075, Pope Gregory VII issued the following decrees. 1. That the Roman Catholic Church was founded by God alone. 2. That the Pope alone can with right be called universal. 3. That he alone can depose or reinstate bishops. 10. That the Pope's name alone shall be spoken in the churches. 11. That his name is the only name in the world. 12. That it may be permitted to him to depose emperors. 19. That he himself may be judged by no one. 22. That the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, the Scripture bearing witness. Select historical documents of the Middle Ages. Ernest F. Henderson, editor, 1892. The popes of the Catholic Church exerted their power, as is evident from these decrees. Christianity was a crucial element in medieval European society.
So some of the corruption that you just heard about in that excerpt is really going to come into play, especially when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, because a lot of that corruption and power, or power is going to lead to corruption, and stuff's going to get crazy, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. One thing that I think we've mentioned before, but I don't remember getting a little mix up between AP Euro and Western Civ. If the Pope is nowhere in the Bible, there's nowhere in the Bible that talks about a Pope, period. So the idea of a Pope is that Peter, the Apostle Peter, was the first bishop of Rome, and the Catholic Church believes that Peter was given the keys to heaven, and therefore he's the first bishop of Rome, and the first bishop of Rome they decided to call Pope, which comes from the Latin word papa, or father, and therefore he is the leader of the Catholic Church. With that, though, is going to come some criticism, because that's not in Scripture anywhere. And so who makes this guy head of the church? Who's to say he's supposed to get all the power and be over the church? Should it be the Pope that's over the church, or should it be a council? It's going to lead to a lot of problems. A lot of power resides within one person, and then these high church officials, or clergymen as they're called. And yeah, so we'll get into that and how that affects the Middle Ages, and then eventually we're going to see that corruption get fought a little bit. So, did you know the term heresy comes from the Greek word heresis, which simply signified holding a particular set of philosophical opinions? The term heresy took on a negative meaning in Christianity. According to the Catholic Church, a person is guilty of a material but not formal heresy if he or she does not know that he or she is denying a doctrine of the Church. So, being a heretic means going against the Church. There we go. So, papal monarchy. The popes of the Catholic Church had claimed supremacy over the affairs of the Church. So again, that's one person in charge of the entire Catholic Church, and they controlled, from what we know, the Vatican City is today where the Pope lives, but back then it was a territory called the Papal States. In central Italy, they were kind of in control over that area, but oftentimes it was at expense of spiritual duties. which is why there's going to be some kickback. The church became increasingly involved in the feudal system, mainly for power and money, getting money from lords in exchange for lands and dispensations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Bishops and abbots came to hold their offices as grants from nobles, which I just talked about, and so were vassals, and bishops being a vassal to a lord is not a good thing, because then they are subject to persuasion by that lord, and then their sermons become corrupt, and they're now teaching and preaching about being loyal to a lord more than they're being noble to the Lord. So these bishops and abbots often cared little about their spiritual duties. We also have some ignorance, not actually knowing what the heck they were talking about. It was a huge problem. Something called pluralism, which they would have control over different parishes, even in different countries, so they couldn't be where they needed to be to support the people. It was a huge mess, not to mention drunkenness, having concubines, which are prostitutes. It was a huge mess. So, by the 11th century, church leaders realized the need to be free from the interference of lords in the appointment of church officials. So Pope Gregory VII decided to fight the practice of what was known as lay investiture, which is when an individual became a church official. He was given a ring and a staff as symbols of the authority he was invested with. Secular or regular people, lay people, officials began granting this investiture. Pope Gregory VII also saw the need to stop this practice so that the church could regain its freedom to get out from underneath the lords that we talked about a moment ago. The sole right to appoint clergy and run its own affairs. Because what would happen is in exchange for land, or maybe even building a church for the clergy, the lords would be given the right to appoint who was going to be in their territory, all the way up to kings. Monarchs would be able to do this too. So it became very corrupt. Maybe the people that were not necessarily good clergymen were being appointed positions because they had a connection with a lord or a king. So corrupt. Gregory VII also believed that his authority extended over all the Christian world, including its rulers, to include kings, and that's going to create a problem, especially when we get to Henry VIII. If secular rulers did not accept this, the Pope would remove them from the church, excommunicate them from the church, which means they can't be saved, which means they can't be going to heaven, which means people don't want to follow a king that's not going to heaven because they want salvation also. So Gregory VII found himself in conflict with Henry IV, who was the German king. German kings had appointed high-ranking church officials for years and made these officials vassals to fight the power of the nobles. So this is a way that the kings actually kind of circumvented and undercut the nobles a little bit. Without the ability to appoint these church officials, the king could not hope to maintain his power in the face of powerful German nobles. So he didn't like the fact that Gregory VII was taking this ability to appoint church officials away from him. And he finally issued a decree forbidding clerics from receiving their investiture from lay leaders. Henry, however, had no intention of obeying this decree, and the struggle between Gregory VII and Henry IV became known as the Investiture Controversy. And in 1122, a new German king and a new pope reached an agreement called the Concordat of Worms, in which church officials first elected the German bishop, and the new bishop then paid homage to the king as his lord, and the king invested him with the symbols of earthly office. So this is all just politics to say that, so the king isn't picking the bishops anymore, the pope is picking the bishops, but then that bishop pays homage to the king, and the king does a ceremony where he gives him a ring and a staff saying, okay, I have invested you now as leader of the church in my territory. So it's all politics and vision on who has power, so that the king still is able to circumvent his power, and the pope is still happy because he's the one electing the officials. So besides lay investiture, Gregory also tried to improve spiritual guidance to the lay people. in the 12th century, popes that came after Gregory were more interested in strengthening papal power and building a strong administrative system versus taking care of the people of the church. The Catholic Church reached the height of its political power during the papacy of Pope Innocent III, who you heard about in the excerpt a moment ago, and this is where things got really corrupt because he believed that the Pope was the supreme judge and ruler over all European affairs. No monarch, just the Pope. There was no secularization, no separation of church and state, just him in power, having a say in everything. So to exercise his power, Innocent III especially used the interdict, which forbids a priest to give sacraments or Christian rites to a particular group of people. And under interdiction, people under interdiction lost the comforts and blessings of religion. So if you were going against the church, you would not receive sacraments, you could not participate in communion, all that stuff that you would normally do that equals going to heaven and getting salvation, can't do it anymore. And so they exerted pressure against their ruler to follow the Pope's wishes. So again, that's how the Pope would circumvent the king and keeping his power over the people. There were also some new religious orders that came about during this time period, groups of people spreading the religion. There was a wave of religious enthusiasm that came across Europe in the first half of the 12th century, which led to a huge growth of monasteries. So basically just missions were spread throughout all of Europe. And the most important of these new orders was the Cistercians, which were founded by a group of upset Benedictine monks. And Benedictine monks were guys that followed Saint Benedict. He's the first main monk that we talked about that created the Benedictine order. That was the order that told monks how they were supposed to live. They were extremely strict, the Cistercians were. They had only one robe, ate a simple diet. Their churches and monastic buildings had no decorations, very simple, modest lives. The number of women joining religious houses also grew dramatically. The female side of this, intellectuals like Hildegard of Bingen found convents, which is the female form of a monastery, which again also we've talked about before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We also have the Franciscans and Dominicans that emerged in the 13th century. Just different groups of people spreading religion throughout Europe is all you really need to know about this. And St. Francis of Assisi is the one that started the Franciscans. He was really big on preaching about poverty and helping the poor. The Spanish priest Dominican Dominic de Guzman, or Dominicans, founded the Dominicans to defend church teachings from heresy, which is the denial of basic church doctrines. So that was their main focus. And churches wished to discover and deal with heretics led to something called the Inquisition, or Holy Office. So Inquisition to ask questions, to investigate basically on heresy. And this also led to a lot of bad stuff because a lot of people were killed due to their heresy, punished. They were flogged, excommunicated from the church. A lot of bad stuff came from that. From 1252 on, those who did not confess voluntarily were tortured until they confessed. In these inquisitions, many who did not confess were considered guilty anyway and were executed. So basically, if they didn't, and this also leads to corruption, because if they didn't like you, they could just have you killed or claim you as a heretic and then try you and torture you until you were dead. So not necessarily a good way to going about saving the church and helping the people. Sacraments of the Catholic Church, such as baptism, marriage, and communion, were also very important to ordinary people. This is a way of receiving God's grace for salvation, and only the clergy could give it. So that gives the clergy a lot of power also, because in order to get salvation, then you have to go through the clergy. And then I'll let you guys read this stuff. These are just kind of anecdotal things from the textbook. You can hit pause and read through them. There's not a whole lot from the lecture on here for you. All the stuff we've talked about. So here's your checking for understanding. Here are the answers. And that's it for section 2. There's Ranger.